So John the Apostle. John, of course, is the author of one of the four Gospels. There are the other three were written first, and they're called the Synoptic Gospels because they kind of give a synthesis of Jesus's life. They talk a lot about the things that Jesus did and said. But John's Gospel was written much later. I think it was written probably about 50 to 60 years after Jesus died, when John was a very old man. They figured John was maybe in his 90s when he wrote this, 80s or 90s. And he was also probably at the point where he was exiled because of his faith, exiled on an island. But John's is a unique gospel because the other three gospels, they talk a lot about, maybe there's a lot of overlap, and they talk a lot about parables and some of the miracles of Jesus, whereas John's gospel talks more about who Jesus is. And this is important because John was a witness to this. John was a witness to Jesus' ministry from the very beginning. And some people will even go as far to say is that John is Jesus' best friend, in terms of like his human close companionship. He was like the guy he confided in most. So when John's gospel starts out, John starts his gospel out very uniquely. It's more of kind of a theological approach, whereas the other one just kind of start right into it with genealogies and with stories and things like that. But John starts off by saying something which will sound very much like the book of Genesis. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be. What came to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." So again, he's already getting into who Jesus is. Okay, and that's important because, again, we can learn a lot about Jesus, and that's a good thing, right? Having a lot of head knowledge about him. But John tries to get to the heart of Jesus. He wants us to know who Jesus is. Okay, he wants us to know him as a person and as a God, but specifically tries to make him more personable so that we can have a relationship with him. And a little further on, there's a very famous verse in here. Verse 14 in chapter 1 says, "And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. And we saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." And so again, he's identifying right off the bat, he's saying Jesus was the Son of God, and we saw it. Okay, and he talks about this. And so his gospel then is this witness of it. And so he starts at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. All right, so John was, you'll hear him referred to as the son of Zebedee. So his father was a fisherman. John and his brother Andrew were fishermen. They were carrying on the family business. But they were also disciples of, not his brother Andrew, what did I say? Brother James, I think I spoke. His brother James. Andrew was Peter's brother. But Andrew and John were disciples of John the Baptist. Okay, and so they were like the two younger brothers were disciples of John the Baptist. And so the Gospel of John starts right off with John the Baptist, and he goes into a whole description of him, and this is where you get, says, "I am the voice of one crying out in the desert, make straight the way of the Lord." Again, he then is trying to identify who John the Baptist was. Okay, and so he talks a little bit about their time with John the Baptist, because the tradition was if you were going to go and learn about the Jewish faith, you would learn then from someone who was like a rabbi or someone who knew a lot more, and you would be like his understudy. And this is what they were doing. Now, John wasn't necessarily as theological. He was just kind of had this following. People were going out in the desert to be baptized by John. And so this is what John the Apostle and Andrew were doing. But then, of course, John says, I'm not the Messiah. I can't even bend down to unfasten a sandal strap. And so one day, just reading here, it says in verse 35 of the first chapter of John's Gospel, it says, "The next day John was there again with the two disciples," meaning Andrew and John. "And as he watched Jesus walk by, he said, 'Behold, the Lamb of God.' The two disciples heard what he said and followed Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following him and said, 'What are you looking for?' They said to him, 'Rabbi, where are you staying?' He said to them, 'Come and you will see.' So they went and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day. It was about 4:00 in the afternoon. And then he goes on to identify them. He says, 'Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, was one of the two who heard John and followed Jesus.'" Now, he never identifies the other disciple. And this is very characteristic of John in his gospel. You'll often hear him refer to himself, or you'll hear him refer to someone as the other disciple, or the beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's John's way of, he speaks in the third person, he's talking about himself. And that's a humility thing. That's not, because otherwise if he says, I saw this and I saw that, people go, oh yeah, who are you? And so he talks about it in these terms. And we'll get into it later. At the end of the gospel, he basically says, I'm the one. Okay. I'm the one who was the beloved disciple. I am the one of all these things. So they start following Jesus. And the first thing they do, they found, they're an example of evangelization for us, right? They encounter Jesus, they stay with him in the afternoon. The first thing they do, boom, they go out and they're telling their older brothers, we found the Messiah. You got to hear this guy. You got to become a part of what he's doing. And so we hear, so John, and he goes and tells his brother James, but then Andrew tells his brother Peter, or Simon, who Jesus then renames Peter later on. And so right off the bat, there's like 4 disciples. And in this first part of John, there's a call in of a couple more, Nathaniel and Philip, or 2 right off way. The other thing that's characteristic of John, one of the things that's characteristic of John's Gospels is he gets into this great detail of the conversation and sets up all the circumstances. So in the one I just read to you, it says, it's 4:00 in the afternoon. We're kind of like, so what? What's the big deal about 4:00 in the afternoon? Okay. So, but here's the deal: is that John he's relating 4:00 in the afternoon because you got to keep in mind that there's no detail in the Bible that's just kind of there for no good reason. John's telling us 4:00 in the afternoon because he's like, this is when my life changed. On this day. And so if you guys probably are old enough to remember 9/11, but maybe your parents can relate this to you. When you heard about 9/11, you knew exactly what you were doing. You knew almost to the minute what time it was and what was going on the rest of that day. That's what John's doing. He's like, my life changed at this moment. It was 4:00 in the afternoon. So John does it. In other parts of the gospel, it'd be like these things like, there's a story of the woman at the well. The Samaritan woman at the well. And he goes, she comes to the well. It was about noon. So what? But you have to know that in that story, you didn't go get water at noon because it was too hot in the day. You went and got water in the morning or late in the afternoon. This woman was going to the well because she was not a very popular woman, and so she was going so she wasn't seen. So that's how we know that.
Is there a difference between St. John the Baptist?
Yep. Yeah, they're 2 different people. They just both happen to be named John. Yep. That's a good question because it can be confusing. No, that's a good question. And so you get these stories and you get these in-depth conversations, with Nicodemus, where Nicodemus comes at night. He talks to Jesus. Nicodemus is a Pharisee. Why does Nicodemus come at night? Because he's afraid. If he's found out to be a follower of Jesus, it could mean his life, right? Because they were trying to get Jesus at this point in time. The woman at the well. This whole chapter pretty much on this story. Okay. There's other ones like that too. I wrote down a couple, which I promptly lost. Oh, right there. I had my glasses on. One with the well, the curing of the man at the pool of Bethesda. There's a big stretch on that one. The multiplication of loaves, which happens to appear in every gospel, but it's in this one as well. Then there, of course, in John 6, there's the bread of life discourse. There's a whole chapter on Jesus describing himself. He basically reveals himself as the bread of life, basically telling us that the Eucharist really is who he says it is. It's him. Okay. Jesus teaching in the temple, there's a chapter on that. The man born blind, and they go into great detail about, interrogating the man. It's a whole chapter, chapter 9 in John's Gospel. Raising Lazarus from the dead, chapter 11. Great detail, lots of detail to the story. So they spend the first 12, they basically cover the 3 years of Jesus' ministry in the first 12 chapters of John, okay? But he doesn't go into really great detail like he did this, and he did this, and he did this, and he did this. It's just these very detailed stories, again, to give you an idea of who Jesus is. Okay? Then the next several chapters, there's like 3 or 4 chapters just on the Last Supper. Okay, he goes into this tremendous detail. If you read that, it's all about the Last Supper, the things Jesus said, and a lot of comparisons. And in there are such famous quotes as this. Thomas said to him, Master, we do not know where you are going. How can we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you know me, then you will also know my Father. From now on, you know him and have seen him. So what you get from this idea what you get from this gospel is that John was there. Okay, so John is an eyewitness to all these things going on. So he's going into great detail about these particular stories. Okay, and so I mentioned to you that that John is considered by some to be Jesus' best friend. Okay, and of course we know that, so then why didn't Jesus pick John to be the Pope? Why didn't he pick him to be the leader of the church? Maybe that wasn't his gift. He knew that Peter was going to be the leader of things, but he had more of a personal relationship with John. Okay, and so think of it this way: maybe you guys have like church friends and school friends. You got like two different sets of friends, kind of like that. I mean, these guys were in the same group, but Peter's kind of like, he's going to take care of the business, quote unquote, business part of the church, and John's going to take care of kind of the personal, and Jesus is kind of priming him because he knows that eventually John's going to write this gospel. But Jesus has another very important mission for John as well. And we hear about this at the foot of the cross. And that's where Jesus, and I don't know if I highlighted it or not, but that's where Jesus basically gives John his mother to take care of. Because since Jesus was Mary's only son, and we know from tradition that Joseph was dead by now, he knew that Mary would be a widow. And widows were typically homeless and poor. They just decided to not take care of them very well. And so Jesus wanted to make sure that John was going to take care of his mother. Okay, and I think I maybe have told you guys this before, but that's also proof that we know that Jesus was an only child. Because if Jesus had brothers or sisters, like some denominations claim, he wouldn't have given his mother to John. That would have been a scandal in that time because he should have given it to another one of the siblings. But he didn't do that, right? Because Jesus, we know, Jesus followed the law. So Jesus was an only child. And so he then said, John, I need you to take care of my mother, okay? And, theologians then extrapolate and say, that's also Jesus giving Mary, not only to John, but to us as the church, as his mother. So again, there's so much depth in John's gospel because of his relationship. And we hear about at the Last Supper how as they're reclining at the table, Jesus has his head on Jesus' heart. He's just resting there. And that might seem a little weird to us, but they just was a closeness. And they knew, that Jesus has been telling them, what, my time has come. Here's what's going to happen. And so, there was a lot of sadness, and there was a talk of the betrayal, all this stuff going on. But think about this, whenever you're in adoration, is that when John was laying there and he was just kind of resting on Jesus, his head was right against Jesus' heart. And so he could hear Jesus' heartbeat. So that's how close they were. Okay, they were that close. And so there's this one part in the gospel where basically Jesus says, one of you will betray me. And it even says this in here, and again, I didn't highlight it, but it's like Peter looks at John, and John looks at Peter, and Peter kind of goes like this, basically like find out who it is. And so John asks Jesus, right? Because again, Peter is going to be in charge of the church, but Peter knows John is close to Christ because they have a personal relationship. No, we'll talk about that in a minute. And so again, it's identifying, with Peter doing that with John, that's identifying John's closeness to Christ. Okay. Now, Jesus has his passion, is crucified, dies, buries, resurrects. On that first morning of the resurrection, and this is one you guys have heard, you'll hear this every Easter. On the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early in the morning while it was still dark and saw the stone removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, John, and told them, they have taken the Lord from the tomb and we don't know where they put him. So Peter and the other disciple went out and came to the tomb. They both ran, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and arrived at the tomb first. He bent down and saw the burial cloths there, but did not go in. That's a key point. When Simon Peter arrived after him, he went into the tomb and saw the burial cloths there, and the cloth that had covered his head, not with the burial cloths, but rolled up in a separate place. Then the other disciple also went in, the one who had arrived at the tomb first, and he saw and believed. Okay, that's key, because remember how I just said Peter acknowledges that John was closer to Jesus in the moment of the Last Supper? Here's where John acknowledges that Peter is the head of the church. John could have gone in, right? John was his best friend. But John's like, no, I need to respect Peter's hierarchy as the head of the church because Jesus is no longer here. And it's this whole idea about, remember at Caesarea Philippi where Jesus gives Peter the keys? He's the prime minister. He's saying, you're in charge when I'm gone. John's like, Jesus is gone. John's in charge. John goes in first. So they had this, Peter and John had this mutual relationship that was very respectful of each other. They knew where they stood in the hierarchy of things. And that's really important how this goes. Steve.
I've always thought of John's gospel as being not historical like the other three, but as a biography. I look at the way he wrote it as being a personal biography, almost an autobiography, because of the personal nature of it. Less history and more about the things that were really important. And I think that's why he mentions himself as a third person, because he doesn't want to say I. He wants to make it a biography. So it just seems to me that that's the way it is. When you read the old, that's what makes that different.
Right, and that keeps the focus on Jesus, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so he could say I, but then the focus is kind of tends towards himself, and he knows again this hierarchical approach. He knows, I'm pretty important, but he knows Jesus is much more important, and so I'm going to refer to myself as much lower. Okay. So now from here, there's little bits and pieces of things, but there's a lot of the tradition of the church of what happened to John after this point. Like JJ kind of alluded to at the beginning, most of the apostles were martyred. John was not. Now think of it this way: at Jesus' passion, John stayed with Jesus, the rest of them didn't. Okay, I don't think it was necessarily punishment, like, hey, you didn't stay with me, so you're going to get martyred. But it was just, the way things kind of worked out. But also, John's mission was different. John's mission was, again, to take care of Mary. Tradition kind of states Mary lived maybe another 20 years or so after Jesus died. Yeah. Yes. John was the youngest of all the apostles. And so in artwork, that's when you see John, he typically doesn't have a beard. Even though he probably had a beard. You ever seen the Passion of the Christ? He's kind of got a short beard, like he's still trying to grow one. He's probably like in his early 20s. The rest of them are older. Yep, that's a good point. So Jesus and John, Jesus had this mission for John, where he was going to take care of his mother, and then he was going to witness to the gospel. But there was a point where, it wasn't like they didn't try and kill John, right? There's actually a piece of tradition that says that under some of the persecutions in like the late 1st century, they actually threw John into a pot of boiling oil, and he came out without a scratch, without a burn. And so they knew, we may not be able to off this guy, so we're going to exile him to this remote Greek island called Patmos. It's kind of closer to Turkey. There's a whole bunch, if you guys know your geography, there's a whole bunch of islands kind of there between Greece and Turkey. And they exiled John to one of them. And that's where he did a lot of his writing, a lot of his reflecting, and things like that. But John was beaten. John was, I think John was scourged. They tried to kill him. It wasn't like he had an easy time of it. He just didn't die a martyr's death. But then when he was very old, then he did write this gospel. And he had disciples around him too. It wasn't like he was totally alone. They came to him. And some of the early church fathers were actually disciples of John. Okay. So he died around 100, 100 AD. He was probably born maybe, he was younger than Christ. There's a tradition that actually says that Mary and John and James's mother were sisters. That's just kind of a tradition. We don't know for sure, which would make John and Jesus cousins, kind of like John the Baptist and Jesus were cousins. We don't know. It's just part of one of the traditions. But John lived to be pretty old. He lived to be about certainly into his 90s, maybe 100 years old. And so John wrote the Gospel of John. He also wrote 3 letters. First letter, John. Second letter, John. Third letter, John. That's what they call him. And he's also the author of the book of Revelation. Revelation singular, not Revelations, Revelation. And it's a very apocalyptic book, which was very popular literature during that time. A lot of symbology, a lot of, people now are trying to, identify all the symbols in it, things like that, and it's just not the purpose of the book. But John wrote this. It's the last book of the Bible. Talks about the end times. Talks about, in a lot of ways, if you listen to some current day theologians, they actually say the book of Revelation is the Mass. If you look at, it's a description of the Mass in symbolic terms. So John lived to be a very old age. He died on the island of Patmos. Right now, there's actually in the cave where he lived, there's actually a church there, Church of the Cave of the Revelation, or something like that. And so you can actually go to this place where they say John wrote the book of Revelation. So what I want you to take away from this is John's relationship with Jesus. He is who we want to be like. We want to be the ones that are, when we're troubled, we want to be resting our head on the breast of Jesus. We want to place our trust in him. When you're praying to Jesus in the tabernacle, just have that vision of John in your mind. And so you just be like, I want to be John, And that's what we need to do with all the Bible stories, is place ourselves in that story. I want to be like John, and just imagine what it would have been like to be able to hear, have your head on Jesus' chest. And one speaker that I have listened to, Father Larry Richards, talks about, he says, imagine that you're John with your head on the breast of Jesus. And every time Jesus' heartbeat, it says, I love you, I love you, I love you. And that's the heart of Jesus, and that's where we want to be. And so read John's gospel. I would encourage you to do that, again, just pieces at a time. But place yourself in the story as John, and I guarantee you that if you attempt that, which is kind of an Ignatian way of prayer, that you will grow closer to the Lord. Okay. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah, Claire. I'm not huge. There is a reason for it. There's always like an eagle there. I think because the eagle's a bird of strength, probably is part of it. I'm sure there's much more depth to it than that. There's probably whole courses in the seminary on the symbology of that. But that'd be a great question. I could do a little more reading and find out, see what I can find out of that. But why is John often depicted with an eagle in artwork and things like, kind of like he's depicted without a beard? That shows his age. Even when he's older, they put a beard on him then. But the eagle, I think, is, there's, who is it? There's one of the apostles that's with a lion, and there's another one, who's got, they got other stuff going on there too. Some of the artwork shows John holding a cup with serpents coming out of it because they tried to poison him at one point in time. And I don't remember if he drank it and it didn't get poisoned, or if he was able to identify it as poison and didn't drink it. But he was able to discern those types of things as well. So, all right. Any questions, either online or here? You guys had some good questions already, so. We're gonna do another reflection. So if you guys want to take out your composition notebooks that I just gave you. And what I found is really beneficial to do. Did everybody wind up with a pen and stuff then too? Okay. What I find is very beneficial to do is the first thing you do is to put the day and date at the top, because it's helpful to be able to go back and see what's going on. And sometimes I'll put a little notation of the day of what's going on. And I was in my guide today, and I had an interesting notation in mine. I realized that today was 37 years ago today I started dating my wife. December 16th, 1983. Some of your parents probably weren't even born yet. But it's interesting to note that kind of stuff, and because sometimes that influences what you're going to write. Okay, and certainly the date does too. But I would encourage you again to write the date down, and I'm going to read a reflection to you guys. And so I'm just going to read this, and if you want to close your eyes and listen, or if you want to jot down a couple notes, then you certainly can do that. And then what I would just ask you guys to do, just spend some time and ask yourself, Lord, how are you speaking to me through this story? How are you speaking to me through this story? What do you want me to get from this story? Okay. I think if I would have been thinking, I would have had these books for you for the last one, so that you could do that. If you want to leave space at the beginning of this, that you could transfer your other one over to this book, you could do that, or you could put it afterwards. It doesn't matter. Just put the date down, so that they're all together. That would be fine too. But again, I'm hoping that you guys will just not find this as some arduous homework assignment or something else I got to do. I'm hoping that this is going to help you guys in your faith journey. Journaling, I'm terrible at journaling. I'm awful at it. Okay, the only 2 times I do well with it is here in church or when I'm on a backpacking trip. I do pretty good on those because I try and put down the details of what's going on so I can go back and look at them later. But there's times when you're journaling in church, or I should speak for myself. There's times for me when I've been journaling in church. Sometimes there's things that, I'm kind of like David. I'm kind of lamenting. Oh, why is this going on, Lord? Here's what's going on. This is terrible. This is bad. Help me, help me, help me. And there's other times there's stuff that just comes to my mind. I'm like, I don't think I would have thought of that. And I write it down. And so I don't know, is that the voice of God? Is it my guardian angel? Well, I don't know. But it seems like it just kind of pops into my head. And so I put it down in my journal. And then I go back and look at it later. And that's where the value of the journal comes in, is when you go back and look later. And sometimes, like I've thought about, I'll be going through a particularly tough time. And I'll go back to a time I'm like, that was also tough. And I'm like, this is pretty good compared to that time. I've had a couple of those. I'm like, boy, I was miserable at this time, and I had one where I was at this one job, and I remember writing there, God, the only reason I'm keeping this job is because you keep asking me to stay. Basically, I'll stay as long as you want, but I'm miserable. But if this is what you want me to do, I'll do it. I'll do it the best I can. But that was like months. So anyway, so I'm going to read a story to you guys. If you want to just put a title at the top of it. If you just want to title it, and a few of you guys might recognize this story. I think I may have referred to it in this class a couple months ago, but I also used this in one of the Emmaus days like a year and a half ago. But even if you've heard it before, every time I hear this, I get something different out of it. Okay. So, yeah, Teresa. I would wait and hear this, and then you can at least let that sit on your heart. But that's your call. All right, so here we go. And just a little backstory. You guys will never, if you ever want to learn about an interesting guy, his name was Paul Harvey. He was a radio announcer, and he always found these stories that were really unique, and you never heard them anywhere else. And he had a very unique way of presenting them. But at the end of it, there was always a lesson there. There was always something you got out of his stories. And I always he would come on 3 times a day. There was this one part called, the third one of the day was always called The Rest of the Story. And that's what this one is called. And I won't even try and do my Paul Harvey imitation because it's miserable. So if you want to call this one The Birds, you could do that. There was a kind, decent, mostly good man, generous to his family, upright in his dealings with other men. But he just didn't believe all that incarnation stuff that the churches proclaim at Christmas time. He just couldn't swallow the Jesus story about God coming to earth as a man. I'm not going to go with you to church this Christmas Eve, he told his wife, stating that he would feel like a hypocrite. And so he stayed, and his family went to the midnight service. Shortly after the family drove away, snow began to fall. He watched the flurries getting heavier and then went back to his fireside chair to read his newspaper. Minutes later, he was startled by a thudding sound, then another, sort of a thump. At first, he thought someone must be throwing snowballs against his living room window. But when he went to the front door to investigate, he found a flock of birds huddled miserably in the snow. They had been caught in the storm and, in a desperate search for shelter, had tried to fly through his large landscape window. Well, he couldn't let the poor creatures lie there and freeze, so he remembered the barn where his children stabled their pony. That would provide a warm shelter if he could direct the birds to it. Quickly, he put on a coat and tramped through the deepening snow to the barn. He opened the doors wide and turned on a light, but the birds did not come in. So he hurried back to the house, fetched breadcrumbs and sprinkled them on the snow, making a trail to the yellow-lighted, wide-open doorway to the stable. But to his dismay, the birds ignored the breadcrumbs and continued to flap around helplessly in the snow. He tried catching them. He tried shooing them into the barn by walking around and waving his arms. Instead, they scattered in every direction, except into the well-lighted barn. And then he realized they were afraid of him. To them, he reasoned, I am a strange and terrifying creature. If only I could think of some way to let them know that they can trust me, that I am not trying to hurt them, but to help them. But how? Any move he made tended to frighten them, confuse them. They just would not follow. They would not be led because they feared him. If only I could be a bird, he thought, and mingle with them and speak their language, then I could tell them not to be afraid. Then I could show them the way to the safe, warm barn. But I would have to be one of them so that they could see and hear and understand. At that moment, the church bells began to ring. He stood there listening to the bells playing Adeste Fidelis and pealing the glad tidings of Christmas. And he sank to his knees in the snow. The man finally came to see what Christmas is all about. In the birds in his barn, he came to see why God needed to become man to save us. Jesus, the God-man, was born as a baby so he could be truly one with humanity. God comes to us where we are to guide us to where he is so that we can spend eternity with him in heaven. The same is true at every single Mass. In the Eucharist, God comes to us to save us and to guide us back to himself so that we might be with him forever.